Welcome to Life with Beth and Court,
where we teach you how to live authentically and build your best life,
one step at a time.
Dearest Courtney Kane.
Yes, present.
What are we mic checking with today?
Well, it's going to be a little confusing because the word I'm going to start with is the opposite of what we're talking about,
Okay.
but I promise I'll bring it full circle. Ready?
Go for it.
Fathers, be good to your daughters. Daughters will live like you do. Girls become lovers who turn into mothers, but not always, because sometimes they don't want children. So mothers, be good to your daughters too.
Oh, I get it.
Do you know that one?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, yeah? Who sings it?
John Mayer.
Is it because I just said John Mayer out loud 5 minutes ago?
I'm pretty sure everyone knows John Mayer sings that one.
You often don't know these kind of things.
That is true. But that is one piece of trivia I actually did know. Tom Casper would be very proud of.
He would.
So that is fitting today because of our topic. So let's kick it off. Welcome back to another episode of Life with Beth and Court. I'm Beth.
I'm Court.
And today we're talking about how to navigate a changing relationship with your mom.
Dun, dun, dun.
Well, I actually made it lighter. Did you hear how I just
I thought I would just add some context.
Yeah.
It doesn't always go dun, 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 but sometimes it does.
But sometimes it does. So this episode was inspired from several conversations that we had as Mother Day.
Did you just say Mother Day?
As Mother Day.
Do not edit that out. We are now rolling with it. Instead of Mother's Day, everyone, it is now called Mother Day. So as Mother Day was approaching, I
love that when I said it, I just looked at you like I didn't know.
We're rolling with it.
All right. So as Mother's Day was approaching, or Mother Day, as we're now referring to it, we had several conversations with people that were close to us. And we just were kind of reflecting on how relationships with your mom can sometimes change and evolve when you become an adult. And we were reflecting on our experiences and their experiences. And, you know, throughout different conversations we've had with people, this can sometimes be, it can be awesome. My version of it, where I went up and made it light, or it can sometimes be a bit disappointing, which is your dun, dun, dun.
And then there's a little bit of somewhere in the middle. Like sometimes it's not always either extreme, but I think the reality is that as you become an adult and you become your own person and you grow and you shape your own values, we talked about this in an episode, I think it was the holiday episode, where like your views and your values change, and sometimes those don't align. But we were talking about the reason it's so different when it's your mom is because most of us, we hold our parents up on this pedestal and we think they're the greatest thing and we love everything about them and what they do. And so when they start to change, right? Or they move into a different season, or you start to change and things no longer are in sync, it feels a little more devastating than it typically would.
Well, and I think that when we say the statement, most of us, I think that's in a fairly privileged world, because there is quite a few people that we do acknowledge that don't necessarily have this loving relationship with parents, weren't taken care of as children, et cetera, et cetera. But we're talking about those of us who may have had a good relationship with our parents growing up. And then once we grew up into a full adult, all of a sudden we're like, like the scales were taken from our eyes. And we've finally discovered that our parents are human.
One of the things I learned from therapy actually was that sometimes parents are meant to serve a certain role. And then once they've served that role and that purpose, then they shift. So we'll use the example of a mother, maybe like a single mother, and she is your world and you look up to her and she's your hero and she is like the symbol of strength and everything you can think that you want to be. And then maybe her behaviors change and she starts becoming more negative, or she has bad coping skills. There is a possibility, and what happens is that they were serving their purpose in that role, and then as soon as the kids were out of the house, they either didn't know what to do with themselves, so they started to shift a little bit, or they were able to become who they wanted to be once that pressure of being a parent was off. And that was like mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Like it took me aback, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, totally. Well, and when you just think about in the context of their mothers and fathers are human. And humans go through stages of life. We go through phases. We grow. Sometimes we regress. So when you think about it in that way, how could someone be the same as they were to your 8-year-old self, to your 33-year-old self, right? Because as you grew and as your views change, and a lot of us, you know, we go out into the world and we form our own views and our own opinions and all of that. And then when you come back to the nest, so to speak, you realize that, you know, sometimes you do align. Sometimes you're like, yeah, I went out into the world and it turns out we still think and behave alike, and I'm fine with that. And our relationship has continued to prosper, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you go into the world and you're like, wait a minute, I formed new thought patterns and new beliefs and I behave in different ways. And now this is weird because I don't agree with the way that you behave, or I don't agree with the choices that you make. And that conundrum right there is just human existence. It just so happens that it's a bit more devastating when it's your parent and you're hoping to come back to the same exact relationship you had with them when you were a child.
Right. I haven't heard the word conundrum in a very long time.
I haven't used it.
I forgot it was a word. Where did that come
I
from?
No, that was a good one though.
Yeah. And I think that's where it gets a little dangerous when it comes to living authentically and having confidence and setting boundaries, because there are some people I know that are very, very strong in their boundaries and they communicate what they believe. They live life their own way. But when it comes to their mom,
oh yeah,
the shame and the guilt just comes swooping in. Like, they could have done an adventure or something that was really courageous or started a movement or something that they feel so passionate about. But then when they think of having to tell their parents, they're like, they don't agree with this. Or what if they're not proud of me? Like, it keeps you stuck in this mindset.
It brings you back to being a child.
Right. You go back to your child self. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And I can even identify with that in different circumstances where all of a sudden I feel like I'm a 6-year-old again.
Yeah.
You know, and so like you said, to you know, living out in life and making my own decisions and all of that, I can be very confident and very, you know, very sturdy in what I believe. That was a weird word choice, but
no,
so I
good.
can be very confident in the choices and decisions and beliefs I have. But then when you throw me back in the arena of family, in a lot of different contexts, I don't know. It's like I revert right back to that child again.
Well, and that's because that's what your mind knows. Like, you have been conditioned because you were raised by this person that that's your role, is that you don't talk back.
That's true.
And you are more submissive. So that's what your mind is most accustomed to. So it's retraining your brain. So one, that you don't live in the space of becoming your inner child when you're in those situations. Right. But also there's the other side of the spectrum, which is going to an extreme, which is you feel frustrated that they're not being the person that they were when you knew them,
or the person that you perceived them to be.
Exactly. So I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the other things I learned in therapy was that we sometimes tell ourselves stories to protect ourselves. And so when I say protect yourself, I use that term loosely. It can be used, like if there's abuse going on in the home, you can block it out, and that's a way to protect yourself. But you also can shape shift the stories and the reality to make yourself feel what you need to, and to make the experience what you need it to be. So for example, I'll just pull something out of thin air. If you had a dad that was verbally or emotionally abusive, and that was so painful to deal with that you just told yourself the story like, yeah, my dad just gets riled up a lot. Like, he likes to just be loud, and like we would have fun and we would play games, and you kind of just shape shift the story into what you need it to be to protect yourself. Or you tell yourself like, those weren't hurtful words. He was just being playful. But then as an adult, you look back and you're like, yeah, I had a pretty good childhood. Like, my dad would get kind of loud and like rowdy and, you know, say some stuff. And if I was telling that story to you and you're my significant other and you're like, well, what kind of stuff? Well, he'd call me an idiot or like say I was being stupid, but you know, like, and then you're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that to my kids.
Right.
And so we tell ourselves these stories to protect ourselves a little bit, or we hold our parents on this higher pedestal than what's actually happening sometimes because that's what we're taught to do. We're taught to look up to them.
Yeah, there's a couple different instances that I remember kind of reading about that same thing. So there was a book called, I think it's called Becoming Me.
Becoming Myself. I bought that for you.
Becoming Myself. Yeah, you bought it for me, and I listened to it. It's interesting when I listen to books, I can remember where I was when I heard certain parts of the book. So
That's
we were at our old apartment complex, and I was walking by the garages near the clubhouse. So anyway,
I never read that book, by the way.
It's
I
actually
often
really good.
will buy books for people and I'm like, this is so great for you. And they're like, did you read it? And I'm like, no, but I just know.
So it was kind of talking about the same thing, what you were talking about, where she had always told herself that, and she believed it, like, you know, that she had a good childhood and, you know, her parents were really loving and all of these things, that, you know, she had a quote unquote normal childhood. And she said that like once she basically went to therapy, it's been a while, so I can't remember the details, but basically like once she went to therapy and kind of talked through it with her husband and stuff, she kind of realized that I think it was her mom, she would have, you know, beer every night, and she wouldn't have just one, she would have two or three, and things that, like you're talking about, like as an adult you may recognize and be like, oh, you drank 7 days a week always,
right?
Like maybe you did have an alcohol problem, but as a child, like you were a great mom. I was happy, all of these things. So it is interesting, that piece of it, that we can form the memories to be what we need them to be, which makes me think of another conversation you had with Counselor Dan about memories.
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to share that? You're
Yeah,
looking at me with your hand open.
I do.
He basically taught me, because we were talking about my memories from my childhood, that memories aren't real. Like you can never actually replicate the same memory of what actually happened. And your mind is just doing its best work to put all of the pieces together that it can. So you can never have the same exact memory.
That's very bizarre to me.
I know. It feels weird to say it.
It feels a little bit like The Matrix or
it probably
like Inception.
Is. Yeah.
Like,
and so a good example of this was I was asked to write an article for a local publication about our Habitat house growing up.
Yep.
And so I got everything out on paper and I was like, this is what I remember. And I sent it to my mom because I was pretty young. And I was like, can you just proof this for me and make sure, like, I want to make sure details are right because it's going to the public. And her response was literally like, I don't know where you got these ideas, but they're not accurate at all. And I don't want my name to be on this story because this isn't what happened. I was like, listen here, Linda, get it.
Linda, listen.
Obviously, I was having you fact check it for a reason, but my mind had morphed it into this whole different world, which makes sense because we're kids and we use our imagination and we do what we need to navigate situations. And so one of the things about the beer that you just mentioned, like the 3 drinks every night, that as an adult you realize like, oh, that might have been a problem. As kids, we don't know any better.
Oh, no, totally.
Like we don't have the wisdom to know what that is. And so it's fascinating because that was a prime example of like my imagination took fragments of the memories and pieced them together in a different way.
Speaking of a perfect example.
Oh,
so
boy.
This one just happened a couple days ago. You know about this one. So I was filling out a medical history for a new doctor that I'm seeing, and it was asking about my family history. And so I'm like going through and it was intense. It took me like an hour and a half to fill out my new patient paperwork. But so I'm filling out the family history and it's asking like, you know, has there been any breast cancer, stroke, heart attack, diabetes, like all these things. And it asks you not just your immediate, but like brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, grandparents, if anyone's had them. Had these different things. And so I texted my mom at the beginning and I was like, hey, when did grandma have her stroke? Like, I can't remember. I'm trying because it asks you what ages. And so I'm asking her all these questions to like you're saying, I need you to just verify, like, when did this happen? Yeah, that's
something you want to fact check.
Yeah. And so I still have to go fix something apparently. But so one of the questions I asked her, and so she was cooking dinner and wasn't seeing the text. So I'm texting her line after line of like, and when did this happen? And what about this? And one of them I said, and when did Papa have his heart attack? And she was like, oh, and so like she was answering the text in order, and she's like, Grandma had her stroke at this time, da da da, and she's like, and Papa never had a heart attack. And I was like, that is not true. He absolutely did. And she's like, definitely didn't. And I'm like, no. And I laid out the whole memory.
You knew you were in a swimming pool at a party.
It was a hockey tournament. I was really upset because we had to go, and I was like, you said this, and then I said this, and there's a running thing in my family that my mom's always upset that I can't remember all the cool things from my childhood because my memory's just terrible. So of course I'm describing in vivid detail when I swear to her my grandpa had a heart attack, and she's like, your Aunt Violet died then, but he did not have a heart attack. And I was like, what life am I living? Like, seriously, this is like the one thing I'm sure about. And she's like, okay, but he didn't. So
I still think we should text Papa. That's what I said.
Really
I'm like, we should text Papa.
I still need to figure that out. But that's an example of where it's the same for Habitat, because you were like, I absolutely remember these details. No doubt about it. These things happened. And so that was another example where I was dead set on it. And I was like, no, this happened in my childhood. And so it is very interesting what our minds do with our memories, or whatever Dan thinks that they are the figments of our imaginations. Yeah. So that can contribute also to us just absolutely immortalizing our parents, our moms and our dads, where you're like, they were perfect and they did everything right. And, you know, anything that happened to me, I deserved it. You know what I mean? Like, there's all these different thought patterns that protect that idea of them being untouchable.
And I think it was pretty common back then, at least for when our parents were parents, that they were taught, like, you don't let your children see the imperfections. You don't let them see that you struggle. There's this whole layer of transparency that's missing. So it's almost like they're playing into it, right? Like, instead of having that hard conversation of like, Mom had a really bad day at work and this happened and it made me feel super sad, which we know now is what we teach children, empathy and social emotional skills. But that wasn't common back then. So they kind of played into, like, we put them up on the pedestal, and then they played into it because they wanted to be construed as good parents. And back then, being a good parent meant that you didn't let your kids see the struggle. So I think that's a big piece of it.
So let's talk about some more pinpointed things. So
hold on, because we have to go back, because we got really sidetracked. So let's go back for a second, because I wanted to touch on the fact that this can go the other way. So we've talked about how sometimes as children, we change in our minds what happened to protect ourselves, which can also lead to frustration. So I had a friend come to me and she said, I am so frustrated because I don't know who my mom is right now.
Yeah.
Like, the way she's behaving, she never did this. She never acted like this. And it pisses me off and I want to call her out. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens when you call her out? Like, have you tried it? And she's like, yeah. And we just go back and forth. And I end up pissed off. And I'm like, okay, so here's my suggestion. You're not going to like it at all, but this is what I would advise. Obviously, your mom is feeling like she needs to meet some need of her own, and she's feeling like she needs to be right, and she's feeling like, you know, she has to have the last say, and this is who she is right now. Like, whatever this is who she is, and you're getting pissed because she won't change it on your behalf. You're getting pissed because she's not acting how she used to, but the reality is, for whatever reason, this is how she's acting right now, and you're wasting all of your energy going head to head with her. Like, do not give that energy.
Yeah. So there's a couple things with that too. When you say things like, my mom never used to be this way, right? Again, you don't know that she didn't, because when you were,
or she's changed.
But let's just go the other route. Let's say she always has been this way. When you're a kid, you don't know that she was being that way because you don't know any different. So when you go away, and maybe it's that, you know, that she's got really, let's say she's really passive aggressive in her communication, right? And as a kid, you don't know any different, right? Because that's what you get at home. Like, you hear the passive aggressiveness.
You don't have the wisdom to discern.
You don't have the discernment to say, like, oh, that's interesting. You're being really passive aggressive rather than just being assertive, or you're being very passive, or whatever it is. And then when you grow up, you move out of the house, you go to college or you go abroad or you go right into the workforce, you start getting exposed to a lot more people who have a lot of different styles. And then you learn these different styles. And then you understand when you come back to a passive aggressive style, you're like, why are you being this way? You never used to be this way. When the truth is,
You just have awareness.
yeah,
now.
she might have been.
Yeah.
That might have been her style all along. You just didn't know it. And so there is that part of it too.
Definitely. And the other part of it is there could have been a change on their side. Like you left, life went on. They might have gotten in a relationship with someone who brings that out in them, or they might have started to have their own journey where they started to feel frustrated about things. But the reality is, like at the end of the day, you cannot change anyone's behavior. Not your mom, not your dad, not your sister, not your friend. Like you cannot change the behavior. So that's why we wanted to talk about this, because there's a way to develop a new type of relationship. So the mom to adult child relationship, because it is different.
Yeah. And we want to talk about this because today we'll be celebrating Mother's Day, right? And
What did you call it?
Mother Day.
Mother Day.
Just Mother
I
Day.
didn't want to forget it. I was super excited.
So today we're celebrating Mother's Day, and that can be challenging for a lot of people. And it can be challenging in the way of, you know, the same thing that we talked about on our holiday issue or our holiday episode, where someone may have lost their mom. And that's a really tough time for them to navigate through, because they were without their mom and they wish that she was still here. But then we also wanted to address the fact that you can still celebrate your mom even if you have differences. And there's still,
For sure.
we say this all the time, that like people aren't either good or bad. People aren't either toxic or the best thing in the world. Like humans are complicated. And so while your mom may have some toxic behaviors, maybe she's got a good heart underneath, or, you know, maybe she was shitty. Maybe she was a shitty mom when you were growing up, but now she's trying to make it up to you. And you're like, how dare you? You weren't there for me when I needed you. And, you know, it's easy to say from the outside, well, what might she have been going through on her side of it? Right. Because that's the part when we talk about you're realizing that your mom is a human, right? Let's say that your mom was struggling with drug addiction when you were a kid and was not around. That's super tough. No doubt about it. That leaves lasting marks. That's super tough, and can totally understand why you might feel abandonment, right? But when you think about it from the human aspect of it, what might you have been going through? Maybe she was terrified that if she came near you, that she was going to screw you up.
And that's empathy. That's putting yourself in their shoes. And I think what a better vessel than when we're adults to actually put ourselves in that situation. And maybe for you, it wasn't drugs, but it was something else, to understand that lens. And another thing I want to share really quick before we go into pinpointed examples is one thing I learned that I thought was really crazy, but makes a lot of sense. If you know you came from a family, like, not that you gave yourself the illusion that it was a good childhood, but you know you came from a shitty childhood or less than what you would have wanted it to be, and you're growing and you're leveling up, the further that gap goes between you growing and your family that might be stuck in the same way as it was when you were a kid or stuck in a fixed mindset, the further the gap becomes, the harder it is to have a relationship. Because you're growing, you're following your dreams, you're passionate. And they're like, well, what the hell was wrong with the life you already had? Like, why are you showing off? Why do you think you're better than us? So that guilt that they can put on you, which truly is just their way of saying we feel left behind. Like we feel like we weren't good enough, but people don't know how to say that sometimes. So they end up guilting you. That's when like the really intense growing pains happen. And so just know, if you're in that situation, there is a way to work through it. Don't ever stunt your growth because your family makes you feel guilty for leaving them behind. You still need to address it, but that doesn't mean that you're supposed to meet their needs to make them feel better.
Yeah, totally. And one last thing before we talk about,
We said that like three
we just keep
times.
saying that, but what I was thinking about is, now I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe it's gone.
Okay.
So let's talk about some examples of ways that you can navigate those situations, like kind of just like the phraseology that you would actually use in the situation. So let's say you go over to mom's house for brunch for Mother's Day, and she says something that's hurtful to you or irritating to you. How do you navigate that? Like, what do you say in the moment?
It really depends, because going back to the friend I was giving advice where I'm like, you're giving her too much energy. There are just certain things you have to learn to let go. Like, for example, if you have a mom who's super into politics and gets ramped up and like goes on and on about it, and wants to rile you up, you just don't do it. And you let them say everything. And I said the key to it is silence. Like, whether you're on the phone or whether you're in person, you're just like taking it all in, nodding, because you're going to get sucked into the toxicity, right? Or you're going to get ramped up and say something you shouldn't. So literally it's this game of silence with a little bit of head nod. Like you're listening to a good song when you're in the car, but just like a chill song. And then once you get through it, you let them keep talking and talking and talking, because they will. And then you say, wow, it sounds like you're really passionate about that. Hey, what were you and dad going to do later today? Like, it's really just letting it ride itself out, not giving it energy or power, ending it with a close-ended positive thing, and then moving on to the next.
You know what I was going to say before? I remembered. One of the things is when we are really close to someone, we tend to try to change them more than anybody.
Yeah.
So when you talk about not giving energy to things, right? Like our parents, when we think about some of the things that we've had arguments with our parents about, it's like, if you were a stranger or if you were just a friend of mine, I would not have been this invested in trying to change your mind. You know what I mean? You're just like, and so it's odd that like we get sucked into this habit of the closer we are to you, it's almost like the closer we are, the more aligned we want you to be with our own views.
Right. Because we're like, it's good over here. Come with us. And then they're like, no, it's fine here. Come with us. And it creates this point of friction. So you really have to pick and choose what you give energy to, because it's not worth it. And then if it's something that you can't ride out, like you are like, ooh, this makes me mad and I have to address it. It's simply very calmly with calm body language is, I appreciate your opinion, but I feel pretty strongly about this and I'm going to move forward with this choice, or I'm going to do this, and then you move on. Like,
yeah.
You don't.
Another example I think of that is if they're speaking poorly about someone that you care about, and one of the ways that I've found is best for me to navigate through those situations is, oh, that sounds like that was a really intense interaction that you had. I've never experienced that with them before.
Shut it down.
Because then it's like you're not arguing about their experience with. They could have had a negative experience with the same person that you always have positive experiences with. Yeah. And so when they're like, "Can you believe that they did?" And I don't like talking about. It just feels gross to have a conversation about all these things that someone else did if we're not going to actually talk to the person. Right. And so to say that, like, wow, it sounds like that was a really negative experience. I've never had that experience with them. Because then it's not saying, well, you know they're a good person, you didn't have a bad experience, because they're just going to dig their heels in. Yeah. But instead it's still sticking up for that person and saying, wow, I'm sorry that happened. I've never had that experience. I've had really good experiences with that person.
Yeah, I think another one that's probably pretty big, I have not experienced this myself, but I can imagine, is moms telling daughters or sons how to live their life. Like, totally. What they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And I am one that would get super offended by that if it were to happen, because I live my life so strongly and true to who I am that I'd be like, skew me? But here's the thing. I think it always goes back to that lens of compassion and empathy. So really reframing it and saying, oh, they're really thinking in their mind, this is what's best for me. And I love my kid and I want them to do what's best for them. So instead of getting pissed about it, it's really like, wow, they care so much that they really want to tell me what they think I should do because they want to see me succeed. It takes the fangs out of it, right? Like you can just take a step back and be like, oh my gosh, that's really kind. But that doesn't mean you cave in. Like you just say, thank you so much. I really, I really appreciate your insight and the advice you're giving me. And pick and choose. Like, who cares? You could say, yeah, I'll really consider that if it's something that you would actually consider.
Yeah.
And if not, just say, I appreciate the feedback, but I feel really strongly about this. And I'm grateful that you'll support that.
Another thing that I tend to tell people that can be controversial if you take it out of context, but it's that you can really mitigate that emotional expenditure if you just lower your expectations. And I know that that sounds terrible, but honestly, like if you have a relationship, so let's say that like
You've said that to me so many times and I never got it. And then once I did, I was like, oh, this is kind of a superpower.
Yeah, because the thing is, you're beating your head against the wall, hoping that someone will be different than they are. And it's like, why? Why don't you just expect them to be how they are? And then if they ever decide to grow or change, you'll be pleasantly surprised. And it's not to say like, well, I'm just going in expecting my mom's a horrible person. Like that's not the point of it. The point of it is to say like, man, I was really disappointed. Like, let's say, I was really disappointed that my mom doesn't ask how I am. Like when we get on the phone, she only talks about her. She doesn't actually ask how I am or listen to my response. Okay. So
yeah, that's tough.
Let's say that is what happens. Right. And call after call after call, you finish the call feeling let down, disappointed because you're like, you didn't ask again. You didn't ask how I was. You only told me about how you were doing. Okay, well, lower your expectation. Go into that call knowing that like, hey, mom's probably not going to ask how I am.
Yeah.
She's going to tell me how she is. And that's great. And at the end,
she's not my person.
And she's not my person.
For that, you just know, my dad asked how I'm doing, or my best friend does. You're exactly right. Like if you go in saying this is going to be the time, or like you're keeping score of how many times she has or hasn't, you basically just say, I'm going into this with the expectation she's not going to ask how I'm doing, and I'm not going to be offended by it because I have plenty of other people who call me and ask how I'm doing.
Totally. The last thing that I will say is that sometimes when we have been wronged by a parent in the past, let's say that, when we were a kid, that, they made a really big screw up. They lied to us. They did something that split our family up, whatever the case may be. It is really easy to hold that grudge and to forever place your parent in that lens and be like, well, you screwed everything up and it's all your fault and you screwed everything up. Going back to that empathy piece and going back to the human piece of it, right? Have you ever made a mistake in your life?
Never.
Nope. And, do you need to be reminded of that mistake for the rest of your life?
No, because it stops you from healing and moving on.
Right. And so it's like, if you think about it on their side, like, yes, they had a lapse of judgment. Are they human though? Yes. And if you're going to know someone and love someone for the duration of their life, to expect them to be perfect is ludicrous. Right. And we've had this conversation in our relationship when you would say like, I just never want to hurt you. And I say like, I know you're going to hurt me because you're human. And I would expect that, because if I didn't expect that I was going to get hurt when loving someone so deeply, that's just naive, because you're a human. I'm a human. We're both going to do things that hurt each other because we make mistakes. And so to not see your parents in that light is really doing them a disservice and you a disservice, because the only person that's harming when you're carrying around with you is you. That load is heavy. Let me tell you, anger and grudges, they will lodge in your heart and it sticks with you for a long time, and it wastes so much energy until you finally get to this point where you're like, why have I been carrying such a heavy backpack around with me? For what? What good has it done? And if there have been attempts to salvage the relationship or apologize, and all of that has not gone well between the two of you, why? Where are you hoping that this is going to go? Right. So just keep that in mind too, that, kind of circling back, I think maybe to one of my first points is to view your parents as humans and to understand that forgiveness is one of the most powerful things that we can give them.
And accepting that your relationship will be different. And I think, again, like using the same mindset, if you don't have expectations, if you do have the expectation that your relationship's going to be different, then you're pleasantly surprised if it isn't. But at the same time, like, you're a totally different person. Your child self is completely different than your adult self. So just knowing that it's not perfect. And I think people probably beat themselves up like, oh, why can't we just figure this out? Or like, why is this so hard? Well, after listening to this episode, we hope that you're able to have a little bit of grace and compassion for yourself, because it's like meeting a different person and being in a relationship with a different person. So we hope that this was helpful, knowing that there is a way to navigate through it, and it is work, but you can do it and you can be successful.
And with that, we hope you have a wonderful Mother Day, celebrating your mom. And if she was a caretaker in your life, thank her for keeping you alive. I think about that all the time as an adult. I'm like, do you know how much my mom had to do to keep me alive as an infant? Like, God, parents are just incredible. Anyway, we hope you have a wonderful day celebrating. At this point, you'll probably be celebrating via Zoom or on the lawn like we did for our mom.
Yeah, that's true.
So until next week, friends, we're glad you joined us this week, and we'll talk to you again then. Until then, keep building your best life.
Bye, guys.